Okay, so everyone who's joined us, welcome to tonight's webinar, talking about how vets can best ensure successful lamb growth. So as always, really very grateful to Sheep Vet Society and all the partners who are working with us on these webinars, and especially tonight we're grateful to Bimeda, who are headline partners for tonight. But most importantly, I'd like to welcome our two guests. And I'm just going to let them each introduce themselves so that their videos then come up on the recording. So, Liz.
Hello, good evening. My name's Liz Genever. I'm an independent sheep and beef consultant based in the East Midlands. So I tend to specialise in working with farmers on grass and forage, sort of more, and particularly really interested in sort of systems, so how it all fits together.
Brilliant, thanks Liz. And Lesley, who, well, neither of them need any introduction, but go ahead, Lesley.
Okay, good. Thanks, Fiona. Good evening, everybody. I'm Lesley Stubbings. I'm an independent sheep consultant, and many of you will know quite a lot to do with the Sheep Vet Society over the years, and I also am still very heavily involved in Scots and all things worm.
Brilliant. We're really delighted to have you both with us tonight. So, we're talking about key areas for sheep vets to get involved with the sheep farmer clients, and particularly tonight, we're looking at holistic approaches to focus on the lamb, the end product, healthy lambs that are growing well. So we're going to be thinking about targets, what we can measure and monitor, and how we might be able to manage those situations. I'm going to start by opening our first poll, which you should, well, one of you should not, yeah, you can see it on the screen, brilliant. So there's just one question on this poll, so if you can answer it as I'm talking, that'd be brilliant. Oh, apologies. And so for tonight's webinar, we're basically dividing lamb growth into 3 separate stages. We're going to talk from birth to 8 weeks, from 8 weeks to weaning time, and then post-weaning. And Lesley and Liz are going to divvy it up between them, and it's all going to be smooth as clockwork because we've rehearsed so many times. That's brilliant. How are we doing? We've had 40% of people vote, so we're just going to hang on for a bit longer. Okay, up to 60% have voted. Doing well.
It's actually quite a difficult question.
It is a difficult question.
It is, because actually there's no one right answer.
It's a Lesley question.
Oh, thanks, Liz. Yeah, it is a Lesley question.
Yeah, but
right, okay, that's excellent, yeah.
Can you two see the results then?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right, we're up to 80% voted. So quickly, if you want to vote, get your vote in now because I'm about to close the polling. Yeah, we'll stick with that. 80% have voted, end polling, and share the results. So what do we think about that? Out of our audience, so for the people who are watching the recording can't see the poll. So the poll is, which one of the following do you rate as the most influential in terms of lamb growth rates? Top answer, we've got ewe milk yield. Next, we've got pasture quality and quantity. And next, we've got ewe body condition score. Followed by worm challenge, followed by genetics, followed by the weather, and not one person has said trace elements. So do either of you want to comment? Well, actually, Liz, you're next. So I'm about to go on to your next slide, Liz. Do you want to make any comment before we?
I'm just intrigued because ewe milk yield is so driven by pasture quality, quantity, and ewe body condition scores. They're all delightfully interconnected, aren't they?
They are. I think the comment that, well, you're going to come on to it, Liz, is that the ewe milk yield bit, the influence of that perhaps isn't quite as sustained as people might think, and that you're going to come on to that, I think, aren't you?
Yeah. Okay.
There we go. Over to you, Liz.
So just to talk through this slide, so we've got on here the growth rates. So as Fiona said, we're sort of interested in this 8-week target, which is relatively, well, we're talking about it a lot more, and we've sort of made a focus in the last few years talking about this 8-week wait, 56 days. So we've got there in the orange bar, And the general sort of target that we're looking at for a weight around 8 weeks is 20 kilos. And that's indicated by the orange line that goes across the graph. And that really comes out of the AHDB sheep KPI project that Lesley and myself were involved in. And then what we also set up, and we'll talk about it in a bit more, but just to explain the graph, is the target at 90 days, which is 12, 13 weeks, which is roughly where we think most people should be weaning. And that target is 30 kilos in terms of as an average across the group. So then what you've got is if those lambs are growing at 100 days, 200 grams, 300 grams, and 400 grams each day, how likely are they to get to that target? So what this shows is to achieve the targets that we're sort of recommending and coming out of that research project is they need to be growing at least 300, well, up towards 300 grams a day to get to that. And that's assuming a birth weight of about 4.5 kilos. So obviously that can be adjusted. So
can I just, your 90 days weaning. So a load of farmers around here will wean when they've got aftermath, and they won't consider. Can you just comment on just weaning times if you're not going to do it later?
So we generally think the industry average in terms of weaning age is around about 16 weeks, roughly 14, 16 weeks is quite common practice. And so the sheep KPI project really started to illustrate because of the role of the ewe body condition score in driving fertility, lamb growth rates and general performance next year, is the longer we have to get that body condition score right before she then goes back to the top, the better. And so it also comes around to competition. So I'll talk about in terms of as soon as lambs are starting to eat grass themselves, that ewe is competing with them for the best grass. So it becomes this trade-off between actually social support for the ewe. She's not contributing a huge amount of energy to those lambs, but she's also competing with them for the best grass. So it becomes this sort of debate in terms of age. And when you start looking at the various information, 12 to 13 weeks seems to be this optimum trade-off. And what's interesting, we'll probably talk about it a bit more later, which is this year, because of the grass situation in a lot of places, a lot of people are thinking actually weaning earlier might have some opportunities. So we'll talk a bit about how you can manage that and the things to really think about if you're going to go weaning a bit earlier. So this is sort of hinted at by Lesley earlier, which is about milk yield, and this comes from NZ information, but it's the principle we're interested in. So what we can see from this is about sort of energy intake that lamb is getting from milk and from pasture or grass forage. So and with weeks along the bottom. So you can see that obviously that milk is very important early on, and actually by about 6 weeks it's declining quite significantly, and the amount of energy that lamb is getting from grass is increasing quite significantly. So this idea that keeping lambs on ewes for prolonged periods of time is of no great advantage in terms of the energy intake of lambs. It's actually detrimental, because if that ewe is eating the grass that should be being eaten by a lamb, it's actually affecting growth rates from a lamb perspective. And if we keep that sheep on, it's not giving us the opportunity to manage her appropriately to get her back into the right body condition score, ready for the next breeding season to start, potentially in a few months away from weaning. So it's this idea is sort of really encouraging the importance of understanding at 8 weeks what's happening in terms of lamb growth rates, what's happening in terms of ewe body condition score, and then we can make quite active decisions in terms of when we need to wean. So do we need to wean earlier to give the ewe more time, or can we wean around 12 to 13 weeks?
Thank you, Liz.
Okay, so I'll pick it up from there, and I think, you know, concentrating on this first 8 weeks. Liz alluded to the KPI project which we did. The other thing that we learned from that was that if we fail to meet a reasonable target and we fell about 15% or more below our 300 grams a day for twin lambs, those lambs never actually were able to pick that up again after 8 weeks, so that there was a lasting effect on their development if they missed that target for so much. So this first 8 weeks is absolutely critical in terms of what's going to happen later on. You miss it by too much and you're not actually going to be able to make it up later. So as Liz has just shown in that last slide, you know, that gap between what the ewe can do and what the lamb is doing, the jaws of that are opening up all the time, and that's where the pasture quantity and quality really comes in. And this picture here is really just really quite young lambs. It's actually a video of them grazing, but these lambs are between 2 and 3 weeks of age, and they are grazing away really merrily. And so really from that point of view, from a worm control point of view, you would argue that there's probably nematodirus and coccidiosis would be the two issues most, you know, at the forefront of what we're thinking about at this stage. But what we've got to remember is that those lambs are taking in infected larvae at this stage. And so one of the things, it's going to be affected by lambing date and by etc. But the question I'm posing here is that it does make us think about when to start effect monitoring. Most farmers leave it too late. So quite often, you know, they're not needing to drench other than for natavirus at 5 or 6 weeks. But if they're not starting to do their monitoring at that stage, and these lambs have gone through one full pre-patent period, and they're not then picking up what's happening. And this year that's been really important, because those who started early saw that there was quite a high count, and they are now convinced, and they know that when it rains, we're going to hit a great big brick wall in terms of infection. So I think that's quite important that we don't ignore that in this early stage. And then if the U treatments around lambing, if we just go to the next slide, Fiona, then really again, just to pose that question, I mean, obviously, historically, we're talking about contamination from ewes in that periparturient period. From a point of view of resistance development, of course, it's an area where we're really trying to take some of the pressure off and some of the selection pressure. And one of the questions there is why is it so deeply ingrained in our sheep farmers? And I think the answer to that is that many of them are still wedded to the notion that actually they are worming for the benefit of the ewe. If you really dig into this, and we go back to my first poll question, you know, people do recognise that milk yield is very important. And I think a lot of sheep farmers still think that if they don't worm their ewes, it's going to affect their milk yield. So, you know, understanding why it is they're so keen and really wedded to this practice. And some of the work that we're doing now is really sort of trying to dig into it to see just how important it is and whether or not we can take some of the pressure off and really identify that cohort of animals that need to be treated from the point of view of contamination.
It'd be great, Lesley, if we could just, when you get onto one of your later slides, because I think it's not only in milk yield, but people are concerned about the ewes setting up that contamination for going forward. So that would just lead in really nicely. I know you're going to talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And, you know, going back to what I've just said, I mean, I'm doing some work on it now and we don't have all the answers, but we're getting some really good data in from a project I'm doing at the moment. But, you know, watching those very young lambs grazing, they're not grazing anything that their mothers put down. They are grazing overwintered larvae. And, you know, talking to a parasitologist now and see what we're seeing in the field, the overwintered larval situation is becoming more and more important as we see milder, wetter winters. So again, just pose that for people to think about.
Brilliant, thank you. Oops. So back to this slide again, and we're talking about this dividing lamb growth into 3 stages. So we're going to go on to the 8 weeks to weaning stage, but before we do that, it won't now let me share our next poll. Not quite sure why. Oh, here we are. We can launch it. Lizzie's grassland poll. So we've got 3 questions on this poll, but they're quite quick to answer. So before we start talking about the 8 weeks to weaning, if you can click on this poll. So for the sake of people on the recording, the questions are, number 1, how often do you speak to your clients about their grassland management? And then we have a range of possibilities from never, rarely, sometimes. So sometimes saying once a year, often a couple of times a year, or frequently, i.e. every time I visit.
Frequently. I had to, yeah, anyway.
Question number 2 is, how often do you walk in your clients' fields? And I don't think we're counting dog walking here, are we, Liz? So, and once again, we've got from never to rarely to sometimes to often or to frequently, i.e. every time I visit. And the third question is, how confident would you be in talking with your clients about specialist finishing crops? And then the choice is from not at all, just a bit, to being quite confident or very confident. So far we've had 60% vote, so I'll give you a little more time to vote there.
We've had someone on the chat say, I try to speak to my clients about grassland management, but little uptake so far. So that's quite interesting. So it is a two-way conversation, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks, Trina. Okay, somebody's raised a hand. So the person who's raised a hand, if you intended to raise a hand, would you like to put a question in the question box? Sometimes people raise a hand and don't mean to raise a hand, in which case that's fine. But could you either click on the Q&A and write a question there?
We didn't mean to.
The person who raised a hand didn't mean to raise a hand. That's usually the case. Right, we've had 72, fewer people are happy to answer this poll, but I think we've probably had enough. So I'm going to end polling there and we'll just go back to that. So, I'm sharing results now. How often do you speak to your clients about their grassland management? We've got a beautiful normal curve here with most people at sometimes, fewer at rarely or often, and few. So basically most people say sometimes, i.e. approximately once a year. But a very good point from Katrina, who put on the chat, she tries to more often than maybe they want to talk about it.
I think that's a really valid point. That's a really valid point, that, Fiona, though, because I think Liz and I would both agree that actually with a lot of sheep farmers, we would find it difficult, certainly, initially, because sheep farmers aren't necessarily wanting and open to talk about their grassland management.
Yeah, that is a very good point.
Videos of fields, they're quite open to talking about grassland. Anyway, that's my own issues. That's a whole different... Anyway,
that's people who send you videos, or you send them videos.
I get sent videos of grass fields.
Yeah, yes, that's a special case in itself. How often do you walk in your clients' fields? And here the most popular is rarely, i.e. maybe once every couple of years. So that's hardly anyone says frequently in that case. And how confident should you be in speaking with your clients about specialist finishing crops? And here, the majority of people say not at all. A third of people say only a bit. Very few say quite confident, and one person thinks they're very confident. So that tells us quite a lot. And Liz is going to talk a bit about finishing crops. In the chat, there's a good point there that this idea that farmers have that there is little they can do, and I think that's the same often with the weather, that it's something that is not in their control. And I think it'd be brilliant to get both of your thoughts on how we can help change minds. Right, I'm going to stop sharing these results because I think they're in the way, and go over to Liz.
Thank you. So, in terms of, as we sort of pointed out earlier, so up to 8 weeks, grass quality, quantity, really important to drive milk yield into those ewes, but also in terms of for those lambs to access it. So what we're looking for at that sort of time is sort of grass heights of around 4 to 6 centimetres would be absolutely perfect in that early lactation in terms of that balance between intakes. But what tends to happen is that early spring grass, this year there wasn't quite enough quantity around, but tends to be quite reasonably easy to manage because demand is high, the sheep are eating a lot. Hopefully it's matching in terms of what's happening in terms of growth. The challenge we tend to see when lambs are getting to about 8 weeks, so in a lot of places, lambing late March, we're looking at sort of late May time, is grass quality is becoming a bigger issue. So this is because the grass tends to want to go to head from middle of May to the middle of June. So what you're seeing in a lot of farms, especially after the drought, is that there's not a lot of leaf and there's a lot of stem. And so that's what that's now affecting lamb growth rates because there's just not enough quality for them to get accessing really in those fields. So the slide on the screen at the moment is trying to illustrate this idea that the optimum quality one, where grasses are going to be at least 11.5 ME, do you mean really high quality, cheap, significantly cheaper and probably better quality than what we might buy onto farms. This is what is going to be perfect in terms of lamb growth rates, milk yield. Do you mean Lesley will come in terms of it might also have parasites in it, but in terms of the types of pasture we're interested in looking at in this early lactation through to 8 weeks to weaning, if all of our fields looked like that one on the extreme left, we would all be very happy. What tends to happen, especially this sort of time of year and a bit earlier, is that swards tend to go to the one that's in the middle, the moderate quality. So you can see it's a bit more stem, a little bit more sort of seed head potentially about, and we drop quality. So we drop the amount of energy that is available for those animals to get. The only thing to think about is they can actually select better diets. So given choice, so if we give them in a set stocking situation, loads of choice, they'll be able to choose a diet that's about 1 megajoule higher than what we could test if we just take a random cut. So given choice, they will choose better quality diet. However, that also has issues in terms of utilization. So there'll be potential bits in that field that they'll reject, and then it's working out how to improve the quality for the next class of stock coming through. What those rejected sites lead to is something that looks like the one on the far right, the poor quality, so around 8 megajoules. So we're looking at sort of poor quality hay type levels. So there's dead material in it, and that's driven by leaves that haven't been eaten. It sometimes is by leaves that have been sort of left over the winter and sort of died away, but not really fully got incorporated into the soil. So that's when lambs and ewes are not going to be doing at their best. So what we've also, the idea of the poll was not to make you feel bad because you never walk fields. It's to give you an idea that actually to go and look at grass fields and see both in terms of height and in terms of quality and composition is quite important to understand actually what is the energy provision for those animals in front of them. And so we can be distracted by centimetres. We'll go back a second, sorry.
Right.
We can be distracted by height, but actually we've really got to think about quality. So how much leaf basically, and that's what's driving those sort of, the lamb growth rates will be driven by leaf and energy. So yeah, next one, please. So this is quite a common way of sort of describing sort of amount of grass in a field is pasture cover. And this is done in kilos of dry matter per hectare. So 1500, which is the top one, equates to about 4 centimetres of sward height. So it's sort of top of your toe on a Wellington. 2000 is sort of 6 to 8 centimetres. And that equates to sort of ankle bone. And 2,500 is sort of moving towards 10 to 12 centimetres in terms of sward height. In my cloud cuckoo land, all sheep farmers should be grazing fields between 1,500 and about 2,000, roughly. As soon as we're heading towards about the bottom one, 2,000 and 2,500, we're getting to, it's a bit too high and the quality potentially might be going. So again, it gives you a range in terms of where those sward heights should be. Sort of anywhere between 4 and 8 to 10 centimetres in terms of sward height would be optimum in terms of growth rate for lambs and also in terms of ewe performance. Some of the challenge is that I speak to a lot of farmers who go, I grow no grass in the spring. Generally is because they arrive in the beginning of April, if not the beginning of May, with their entire farm with less than 1,500 kilos of dry matter on it. Basically, it's scalped. There is no leaf area. There is nothing to fix sunlight. So the grass doesn't grow because it doesn't have any of its solar panel out to be able to capture the sunlight to get that growth starting. And that's because they're overgrazing in the winter. So in a lot of that situation, most fields need a 3-month rest period over that winter, and most fields on a sheep farm don't get it. So the reason why we go into the spring with a deficit and have to feed and put cost into our system is because we haven't planned how we get through the winter well enough. So hill farms, there is challenges in terms of winter, in terms of growth rates and temperatures and all of that, but a lot of it is driven by the sheer number of animals they carry over that winter and thinking about other options for that. So away wintering, is there an opportunity to forage crops? Is there other things that can be done to get those animals off grass to get them set up for that spring? So this one just sort of illustrates also when we're starting to think about when lambs, particularly after 8 weeks, those lambs are starting to eat quite a considerable amount of grass. And so what we're generally thinking in terms of allocation for those growing lambs is to allocate them 4% of their body weight, which is really over allocating them, which means they choose the best stuff all of the time to really push on the growth rates. From a grazing system perspective, we need to make sure that there's another class of stock helping to tidy up those fields for the next group coming through. But we're always trying to encourage those lambs to just basically choose the best bits. The bad analogy I sometimes use is like PG tips. So they're just trying to choose the tips of the grass, and that's what's going to be driving growth rates. But that is dependent on having sort of thought process around how that field or series of fields are going to be grazed with those ewes and lambs.
Thanks, Liz. Lesley.
Okay, right. So, I mean, we're in this 8 weeks to 12 week period now, and I'm sure everyone's seen this before, but just, you know, a reminder of the hatching infective larvae situation that those lambs are now going into. As we said, the overwintered larvae are becoming, I think a lot of us now are coming around to think that overwintered larval burden is becoming more and more significant relative to the eggs dropped by ewes, and that is an area where there's going to be, you know, possibly a bit more debate, but I don't think that is perhaps as important now as it used to be. So our lambs, though, from 8 weeks to 12 weeks are starting to go into this massive, great big hump of infective larvae. And I think in the questions we may come back to the fact that this year that is going to go from 0 to massive brick wall on a lot of farms very quickly. Now that we've had rain, whether we've had enough yet, I don't know, but it will go very, very quickly from them sitting in dung to being infected larvae. And that's a factor that I think that we need to, it's perhaps something we can engage with clients with this year because it is such a risk. I think if we move on to the next one, Fiona. So what this is a representation of an actual flock. Each cross on there is a lamb, and there's actually the output from the electronic weighhead over the season. So you've got months along the bottom. We've got our 2 targets there of 56 days and 90 days. We've said that the 56 days is sacrosanct. We need to be hitting that. So that green line of 300 grams a day is what we're aiming to do. We can see that, you know, the average looks wonderful. The average in this case is over 20 kilos, but we've got a big cohort below that, and we've also got a cohort above it. But then we're looking at this 56 to about 90 days. As Liz said, that's probably the time when we should be considering weaning. And in a lot of flocks, what happens is you can see that just before 90 days with this one, things pancake. And then they're weaned at 90 days, and then gradually they're picking up and they're getting back on target. But what a lot of flocks do is the pancaking carries on because they do not wean. They're going into this poor reducing pasture quality that Liz was talking about, and they're also going into that higher and higher infective larval burden that's been building up on that pasture that they've probably been, even if they've been rotationally grazing, it's still been building up on those rotational paddocks as they've gone on from when they were actually turned out or put out there post-lambing. So this is really critical. This flock is doing very well. To see one like this was after a lot of input with the KPI project when we got the grazing right and we got the worm control right. You will rarely see that. You will see this pancaking. So I think, Fiona, in terms of monitoring, with the ability that we have with you know, the information flow we can get from EID now, those people who've got this sort of information, once they see this, then they want to actually beat it. But it's really important that there's 2 things, pasture quality and the worm burden. And it's really driving what we're saying is that we really need to be thinking in terms of weaning at around about that 90-day stage in the majority of cases. Okay. We missed one.
Oh, did we? I apologise.
Fiona's truly happy. Okay, so I think the other point I just wanted to make about this as well is that, because I know a lot of people will be engaging with their farmers with fecal egg counting, that's great. And as I've already made the point is, I think quite a lot of them aren't starting soon enough. Because one of the things about that, if we just start on the right-hand side there, is that obviously effect will help determine the need for a treatment. And we can use them for drench tests, but more and more importantly, I think it's this question of contamination mapping, and it's this doing regular monitoring and knowing where a farm is in terms of the contamination that has gone on before, because it's easy to forget that a FEC is historical. It's giving us a snapshot of what those lambs actually ate in terms of infected larvae about 3 weeks ago, certainly 2.5 to 3 weeks ago, because it's only giving us an indication of the number of adult worms in the gut of the sheep. So again, this year that's going to be very important, because in the situation that we're in, where it's been very, very dry on a lot of farms, we know we were seeing some quite high FECs early on this season in quite young lambs, and then it's gone very quiet because it was very dry. We get the rain and the thing is going to explode. And if we wait for a high FEC, then we're going to miss a lot of that. And so I think, Fiona, this year is the year where monitoring lambs carefully, looking at growth rates, looking at what that contamination was earlier in the season is going to be critical if people aren't going to get caught out. So again, I think that's a conversation that we're certainly going to put a press release about this tomorrow, and hopefully it might be something that sheep farmers will be talking about.
And Lesley, what about clinical condition of the lambs? Is this one of the situations where a bit of shepherding and making a decision on what they think they look like? Definitely.
I think we mustn't put too much store in a FEC count as we are at the moment. Yeah, definitely how the lambs are doing, growth rate, clinical signs. If they're not looking right and the FEC has started to move even a little bit, I would be lowering my thresholds quite a lot in terms of recommendations to treat this year.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of question that's linked to that. So what is there an optimum rotation length from a worm burden perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Liz, isn't it? Because a lot of people, it's a very often asked question is, does rotational paddock grazing improve or not? In terms of nutritional quality, it should allow the animals to be more robust in the face of a challenge, because we're giving them good quality in the sweet spot all the time, we hope. But in a year like this, it's really difficult because we can't predict when we're going to hit that crescendo. And if you're really unlucky and you come back round those paddocks just at the time when that paddock's gone whoosh, so again, I think we've got to, the general consensus, I think, is that paddock and rotational grazing has massive potential in terms of keeping the quality right in front of the animals. But in terms of worm control, I wouldn't be making any claims on it, because it could go one way or the other depending on how the timing is.
No, and I agree. And I think it also can potentially make that FEC monitoring quite challenging, can't it? Because as you say, it's historical, but it's potentially the historical of the paddock you've just come off.
Yeah, so you've got to log it. So if you do a FEC and you log it, I spent quite a lot of time doing a table for some clients yesterday where we're logging these groups, because if we don't do that and we don't keep a record of it, then we won't know. When we come back round there, at least we'll know, we can be able to say, oh, hell, we had a 750 count on there 3 to 4 weeks ago. Look what the weather's done. Perhaps we'd better not.
And is there a bit in terms of sward height? So because in that rotation, the idea, maybe not this year, is that we're taking the sward at a slightly higher height. So, I'm also slightly. Yes, it might affect ingestion rates a bit, but it's not a silver bullet at all, is it? There's still risk attached.
No, and I think the risk this time is a lot of people have taken it right down, and they've been, when it does rain, it's down, and so that's going to actually make it worse rather than better. So this is the year to, yes, let's keep FEC monitoring, but let's not actually hang our hats on it completely. As Fiona says, go on clinical signs and the history that we know of these fields.
We've had a question here about whether individual worming treatments based on individual growth rates instead of group treatments based on group FECs, is that a better idea?
I mean, certainly for my guys this year who are doing growth rate, we will be using TSTs like never before, because that will be the best indicator, I think. Unfortunately, as you all know, a lot of sheep farmers still don't have weigh scales, but certainly if they do, then the TST approach on growth rate, I think, was going to be absolutely where we want to be this year. Mm-hmm. And we want to be there every year, but this year will come onto its own, I suspect.
Yeah. I'm just going to, there's a question, there is another question there, but I'm just going to move you on a bit, Lesley. Otherwise,
move me on, I'm conscious of the time.
Come back.
Yeah, I just wanted to make this point as well. It's granny and sucking eggs, I know, but we still have a long way to go. We still have vast numbers of animals that people treat and then they're underdosing them. And that's not, it's an issue for resistance, of course, but it's also an issue in terms of how well those animals are going to perform downwind of being treated, you know. So it's just to make that point that here, you know, you've got, if you don't weigh and you think those animals are actually 36 to 40 kilos instead of over 40 kilos, then we're 1 mil down. If we don't calibrate the gun, and then if we don't actually drench them properly, little increments, we're soon down to less than 2/3 of the dose those animals should have had. And you know, it's real basic stuff, but there's a lot of work still to be done on that with our sheep clients. Many lambs are still being underdosed.
And isn't it something like 30% of the time somebody thinks they've got resistance, actually you go back and it's a drench gun issue?
Absolutely, you know, and I think it's a debate we've been having recently that, you know, resistance, I think we've got such a high level of awareness of resistance now, we've almost got to be careful not to overdo it, because there are farmers out there who are assuming they've got triple resistance and they haven't. And you know, we've got to be quite careful, I think, that we don't beat that drum too hard and we just take a step back from it sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yep, okie doke. Oh, there we go. Just there's one poll here which I'm going to open, and then we can you see Jonathan's question there? I shall read out in a minute. I'm just going to launch this poll. So this is just one question, so it should be a quick one. What do you think are the main barriers to sheep farmers implementing SCOPS principles? And then we're asking you to choose 2 out of the list, of which I will say when we've got our answers for those in the recording. And this fits very nicely with Jonathan's question, actually. He's undertaking a research project into practice of farmers' worm control. He's had 15 responses, none of them perform FECs, and 2 out of the 15 always perform lamb ones, but most rarely do. Have you got any suggestions to how to persuade farmers? Constant badgering discussion doesn't seem to increase engagement. Oh, apologies. I've just realised the poll will only let you answer one question. That is totally my fault. Only choose one. Sorry, that's a technical cock up and it's my fault. You can only answer one question, so you have to think of the one main barrier. Apologies. Yeah, any thoughts on Jonathan's question there, Lesley?
Oh, well, I think that's why I've put this in here, Fiona, is that, you know, it's a double-edged sword, really, isn't it? I mean, FEC counts, I think they're extremely useful, but there are a lot of other things that some sheep farmers need to do before they get really into that. They don't get that it has to be a monitoring thing. They expect us to do a FEC and it's going to be the silver bullet and you're going to be able to diagnose what needs doing from it. And of course, we can't do that. And it's, you know, so for some sheep farmers, you need to work your way into that gradually. There's a huge fear, I think, and I've put fear of change on this poll. There's a huge fear there that farmers don't want to put a dent in their land performance. And anything that's going to change that and is going to take away that regular drenching that they've been doing, they can be quite fearful of. So it's a question of trust and a question of confidence, I think. So win their trust with something else before you go piling in, trying to get them to do a lot of fecal egg counts would be my advice.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because they sort of, it's as if you're not on their side, as if you're not doing it for the best interest. It's to say, yeah, it's a tricky one. Right, we've had 82% voted, and I think there's an odd 20% who are not happy with voting here. So I'm going to end the polling and share those results, because this is exactly as Lesley was answering Jonathan's question. It's a similar stuff. This is what the audience think. So 2 main barriers to sheep farmers implementing SCOPS principles. You can't choose 2, so everyone's gone for their top 1. Too complicated or time consuming comes out as a top. But quite closely behind, we've got anthelmintics are too cheap and accessible, followed by a lack of confidence and trust, followed by listen too much to neighbours, non-professional advice, and fearful of change. And then so the three that have come out lowest in that was either they're not bothered, or that the cost is too high, or they've had poor experience with previous effects. That's interesting. Was that as you were expecting, Lesley?
Yeah, it is a bit, really. I mean, I think, you know, we made the point about the fact that, you know, I've just made the point about how farmers are aware of resistance, and there you are. They are bothered about resistance now. If you'd done that 10 years ago, you'd got something quite different. But I think too complicated and time consuming, absolutely. And it is a lot more complicated than what we had before, and we can't run away from that. So somehow in the way that we approach it, we have to take it in small bite-sized pieces that are appropriate to the person we're dealing with. And everybody learns in different ways. But I was reading something recently, and it reminded me that as experts, not that I'm really an expert, but you know, we make lousy teachers because we assume too much. So, you know, you've really got to take it in nice, easy, steady stages for people to get that confidence. But yeah, anthelmintics too cheap and accessible. Yeah, they are. And they have been for a long while. And again, it's difficult to come back off that. So now that's very interesting, but it's kind of what I hoped, I suppose. Yeah. Mm.
Somebody's added in the questions that they think we've left out an answer there, which was lack of awareness of the scheme. And yeah, and maybe that comes back to all of us, that there are still, yeah, I agree, people are a lot more aware than they were, but it's almost a barrier now, that they don't want to think about it as much as they don't know that there's an issue there, although I'm quite sure there are people who...
Yeah, I'm very conscious that the awareness button has been hit really hard, and we've now got to be very careful how we deal with that now. Mm.
Okey-doke. Right, I'm going to stop showing those results so you can see the screen and move on back to this slide again for you, Lesley.
Yeah, okay. So really this was just me sort of trying to finish off a little bit to say, coming back to this one, that, you know, obviously weaning is going to be, one would hope, and this year particularly, as we've said, we want to be trying to time weaning so that we're going to avoid this great big massive patch of infected larvae. But the other point I was going to make was that there could be a little bit of a dichotomy here this year, in that there's pressure on farmers to wean earlier, because obviously Liz quite rightly is saying, well, you know, the grass isn't there, we've got to prioritise the ewes, and that's absolutely right. But if we go much earlier than 12 weeks, and I've heard some people talking about going down to 8 weeks, and there's quite a lot of evidence that even 10 weeks, you have got to be pretty darn sure that you are going to move those lambs to somewhere where they're not going to hit a brick wall of infected larvae, or the wheels will come off, and they will come off big time. So there could be that dichotomy there this time, Fiona. I think that, you know, we've got to really be considering, yes, early weaning is a good thing from the point of view of the animals and the ewes and everything, but we've got to look at the worm levels for the lambs and try and do a swapsy with cattle, or, you know, aftermath if it's there, or try and think of something else. Otherwise we might have to delay it and take a little bit of a hit.
And it's also driven by quantity. Do you mean they've got to be going on to good feed? Do you mean it's got to be good?
Yes, absolutely, Liz. Absolutely, yeah.
The original work that was done on the 8-week weaning was really based on shifting ewes onto poor quality stuff, or being able to. So it was a bit of a management strategy to be able to get a big group of ewes off onto poor quality feed that the lambs wouldn't do on.
Yeah,
but that's moved on to specialist crops. So it needs to be done with a management strategy, not just our fancy winnings. And
exactly.
It needs to be thought about.
Exactly, and I think this is where we have to be careful when we're putting messages out there that, and I don't mean us, but people generally, oh, you know, this is a year to wean early, you have to back that up. And I think, again, it's a conversation that can be had with sheep farmers out there, face to face, or on Zoom as we do all these days, you know, about what the other bits, as Liz is saying, that go around that's going to influence the decision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, so this was, again, just a reminder again about this with weaning, that of course we do have this massive hiatus when we come to weaning. Farmers do like to drench at weaning. If we're talking about going to low challenge pasture, then there is the need to consider not just taking resistant worms with you if they are going to worm. So worm on the basis of the fact they need it. So let's have a FEC count and let's make sure they do actually need it. or you're doing growth rates, combination of both. And then the best strategy I find these days is to treat the lambs, take the ewes away, wean the ewes away, leave the lambs where they are for 4 or 5 days. From a stress point of view, they settle so much better anyway. They won't really skip a beat, and then that just allows the delay of the move to pick up a mixed population of worms and just mitigate this dose and move. So I think it's a win-win really, but that was really just a reminder to everybody because it is quite a dangerous time.
Okay.
And then just finally, and again, just a point to make really, that I think everybody listening is going to be au fait with the fact that, and I don't think it's a no-brainer that we would use a group 4 or 5 as a quarantine drench. And then the second time that we're looking at is a mid to late season drench for lambs. But the question about that is, when do we do that? And a lot of farmers are now becoming hooked on the fact that that is at weaning. And it isn't at weaning in most cases. I think if we go to the next slide, Fiona, some of you will have seen this before, but you know what's happening over a season is that we're starting off with our lamb here, and at his first drench, we've got a mixed population of worms, green susceptible, red resistant. So we treat, we end up with him having the resistant ones left. We might have to treat a second time, and the second time we're ending up with a few more, and a third time a few more, because there's a cumulative effect. These worms will stay alive in the lambs for quite an extended period. So we're getting to the stage where what we want to do with our group 4 or 5 is to come in and hit that accumulation as far down the line as possible, really. Now, a lot of people are now starting to go in and they might have only treated their lambs once or if that, and they're thinking weaning's the right time to do it. If we bear in mind what we're trying to do is hit that accumulation, then we can perhaps delay that later on. If we're going to do it associated with moving to very low challenge pasture, we've got to be really careful that we then don't take resistance to group 4 or group 5 into that situation with us.
Well, the other advantage doing it a bit later as well is there's hopefully fewer lambs there, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Although I've heard this time, one or two, I've heard it twice this season, people being advised to treat their lambs early in the season with a group 4 or 5 because they're only little and the dose rate is low.
Oh no.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Dear.
So this is why I think, again, and hands up, you know, the messages perhaps haven't been clear enough, but the when is really important as to when we use these break doses, however you want to the terminology you want to use.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
really,
before we move off worms, Lesley, can we just go to these 2 questions? Thresholds for FECs now. I know in the updated Scots we've got some thresholds in there.
We have.
Meanwhile, we can access that on the Scots website, the thresholds. Or
Well, it's not. That's not quite live yet. It's being built at the moment. But the threshold for a mob is 500. But you know, it is quite arbitrary. But yeah, 500 because it depends where you are in the season and what's going on. But generally speaking, 500.
Uh-huh. And then, Joe, I haven't read this question. I'm sorry. Mild winters, decreasing overwintered larvae.
Increasing.
Using up reserves, when there's a cold winter, they hibernate and wake up as warm up in larger numbers. Yeah, do either of you want to?
So the idea, I suppose the idea is that because they're mildly active, they're using up their reserves quicker, so they're more likely to die off. That's his argument, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it does depend a little bit on the species, but generally speaking, what we are seeing is higher levels of overwintered larvae. That is actually the reality of the situation. And certainly, most important is where you've got a farm where you've got homunculus. You know, we used to say homunculus was killed off over winter. Don't you believe it? Not anymore. And that's part of the reason why we are getting so many problems with homunculus now.
And we've got Paula here from Ontario asking us about problems with homunculus, informing from Atcha. So, yeah, I know it is a big issue in Canada, but equally here on
it is.
Some, is it?
Yeah, and you know, I mean, obviously, in fact, on ewes and so on, but I've reached the stage now as well whereby I've been playing around with, because we've got the technology, actually ewe weight changes much more sensitive than the Famacha. By the time you get to the Famacha, you know, but yeah, you'll pick out the animals that need to be drenched. But I think weight change as well is something that we need to get into with these ewes with hemonchosis.
And then, right, I'm just going to stop with Jonathan's question now, so we'll move on to Liz. But do you recommend delaying the move or leave some untreated, or do you recommend doing both, leave some treated and delaying the move?
Just one or other. Boy, life gets really complicated if you try to do that. I mean, of course, this is where the debate comes as well. If you are going to use a 4-5 at weaning, which we're saying is not necessarily the right thing to do, you are not going to want to leave some untreated. It's going to have to be a delay move. But you can do either or, so long as you take some animals, you take some mixed population worms forward with you, and you don't give those resistant worms complete reproductive advantage.
And I think it's helpful that there are a couple, you know, there are different options there, that because everyone likes a bit of a choice, don't they? It's not always the same decision on.
Well, no, I mean, not everybody could leave the lambs where they were and take the ewes away. I mean, I'm saying from a management point of view, that's the best thing to do, but it may not be possible, in which case you would have to do a partial treatment.
Mm-hmm. And would you say strongyloides, low pathogenic? I'm not usually concerned about strongyloides. Have you got any comments to say there, Lesley?
No, neither am I. And I would want a parasitologist to comment more on that, but definitely, from my point of view, it wouldn't be a problem.
Brilliant. Thank you. Going back to Liz.
Yeah, so this slide is just sort of, it's indicating basically what we're now thinking of, sort of that post-weaning phase. So as we discussed before, the target really for the group is 30 kilos at weaning, which is roughly 90 days. What we tend to see is that actually most farms reasonably easily hit that 8-week target, a bit dependent on the season. But what is quite challenging is to get to that 30 kilo target by 90 days because of what Lesley talked about in terms of pasture quality and also that worm challenge. So this slide just sort of indicates, it's simple that in terms of the energy and protein that those animals are being able to take in will then impact in terms of what their growth rate potentials are. So this is just a slide talking about what energy and protein requirements are those animals looking for to grow at certain weight ranges. So it's just really for reference. And what we also have to remember, and I mean it's a core principle of SCOPS, is that part of this sort of dealing with this worm challenge is using grazing management techniques or different ways of actually reducing the risk of them ingesting parasites. So on the screen in front of this, and we spoke, and then within the poll earlier was about this more specialist finishing crops, and it's becoming a more interesting, or a lot more interest in these sort of crops. So we've got top left, I think, is white clover and ryegrass. Below that we've got red clover, and it's actually a hybrid. Then we've got a brassica type crop that happens to be kale in the middle. Then we've got the chicory, this is chicory and clover stand, and then below that is plantain. And so I'm not saying that everybody needs all of them, but actually some of them have a really important role in some of those, in most farms, to sort of break the worm challenge for lambs, potentially better quality feed for silage for some, so particularly for red clover, do you mean high quality silage for those using around lambing time, and then a really nice crop for those lambs to be finishing on. Also, similarly, brassicas can have a really important part within a reseeding program and is important in as a break between grass to grass reseeds. And there's some evidence in terms of chicory for an anthelmintic property, and partly to do with how that leaf's structured and also the condensed tannins within it. So all of them, and that's what I find interesting about grass and forage systems, is it's like, I describe it as 3D chess, because there's lots of different options. It's trying to work out the ones that are most appropriate for that farm. But it is about thinking, actually, what can I do to get those lambs onto a different crop, growing well? And actually that does release some grass for ewes, and also takes the pressure off to get the sward heights ready for topping. So not necessarily detailed about which specialist crop goes where, but I'm just highlighting there is a huge number of options out there that can be pulled on and can be used on most farms. And then this is sort of the key points from the various, well, fits in across all of us really, which is, but when we're talking to those farmers, we're really trying to indicate what is their pinch point of the system. So that's, for me, anything that's indirectly or directly costing them money. So it could be something to do with body condition score isn't being managed quite well enough. Grass quality is an issue at certain times of the year, as is grass quantity. So what is actually driving that business to not quite do as well as it should be? For me, when I'm thinking about lamb growth rates, I think about energy intake. So is there enough energy available for them to take in? Bit about protein, and we can argue whether protein and parasites should be switched. And then I think about trace elements. While some farmers, would reach for the drench gun first without thinking about the other elements that are important to drive lamb growth rates. What we haven't really discussed is, particularly at weaning time, the importance of separating those lambs into groups so they can be managed appropriately. So the idea of short, medium and long keep type lambs. And again, some of the crops I talked about can be targeted to those particular groups, remembering that a lot of those, for ruminants, we need 2 to 3 weeks in terms of transition onto any new crop. So we need to choose the weight and age of that animal appropriately, so we're not asking lambs that are quite close to finish to adapt to a new diet and then grow and then be finished quite quickly. So we also have to plan in terms of where those animals are going post-weaning. And then, as I've mentioned, this specialist finishing crop, both in terms of lamb performance, but also in terms of the added benefits within that grazing system to release more grass for those ewes as they head towards topping.
Great, thanks Liz. I've flicked it onto our last slide. This is really time for Q&As for everyone. Lesley, have you seen there are a few on this chat that directed at Himonkas, so I'll go back to those.
I've got Kim's question there about monopantel. I mean, I don't really know, Kim, but all I would say is that if you think about the mode of action of monopantel is most closely related, I believe, to a 2LV. And a 2LV would be very short acting, in and out active paralysis type of mode of action. I think I'm right in saying that monopantel is closest related to that. So I'm not aware of any duration of action, and mainly based on that mode of action, but you know, I think we'd need to delve into that a little bit more, but I'm not aware that there's any problem with that.
And then something about Himonkas transmission in housed animals from some reports in Finland.
Yeah, well, it's quite surprising actually. You know, I mean, there's quite a bit of work about transmission full stop, isn't there? I mean, I've known nematodirus to be transmitted in silage from where we, foot and mouth year, where lambs were kept indoors for a long while. Massive nematodirus outbreak in housed lambs because they've been eating it out of silage. Great. So I wouldn't be that surprised, but equally, Himonkas is pretty good at hitching a ride in housed ewes as well. So are we looking at this being you know, hyperbiotic larvae coming back into to being, or is it actual transmission? So yeah, I haven't read any papers on that, but the hyperbiotic larvae I think would be more important.
Great. And Joe's reminding us actually that at one stage I thought we had a slide note about target growth rates, so both pre-weaning and post-weaning. So do we want to divide that into up to 8 weeks? So when the lamb is on the ewe, you know, in New Zealand they would definitely say 400 grams a day, wouldn't they? For I'm quite happy with 300, but so your graph there, Les.
Yeah, they would, Fiona, but how many of them actually achieve it would be the question.
Oh, they just write it in the books, do they?
And it is a bit like, you remember the big fish, don't you? You remember the ones that do.
You saw my graph. You saw my graph where I showed, and each cross was an individual animal. If you remember those crosses, there were quite a lot of animals that were up there at 400 grams a day. So averages are very dangerous things. Those of you who know me know I loathe averages, because actually...
One hand in cold, one hand in hot.
All right, Liz, all right. And, you know, the thing about that is now, when you've got that information, the top lambs are doing really, really well. So they're doing 400 plus grams a day. The ones that are the wastage factor and that are eating into the profit are the ones that aren't making it. So it's making us ask the question, why are those animals not actually making it? And in reality, you know, that 300 grams a day to 8 weeks, as Liz says, is really achievable, but a good proportion of lambs aren't achieving it. They're really not. So yeah, you know, yeah, they can blow their trumpets at 400 grams a day, but I bet you if you saw those graphs, they would still have a good cohort well below 300.
And I think,
but Joe's actual question was, what do we think the target should be post-weaning? So
the bit that we have to remember is that we're trying to maximise really growth rates, optimise growth rates up until weaning, and then there is a bit of a debate in terms of what that marketing pattern is for that farmer in terms of what those target growth rates would be. But generally, the lambs that leave the farm as quick as possible are the ones that are going to make us the most money, even though potentially there's higher prices in the new year. It's also mortality and treatments and cost and labour that doesn't always lead a positive margin.
And
so
grass that really the ewes could eat.
In reality, so is it optimistic to say they'll still be growing at 300 grams? Yes. So there will be a slight decline as they become less efficient in terms of from a digestion perspective. But certainly on some
aim for 300 grams. You've got to aim for 300 grams. You're probably going to fall short of it.
And on some of those finishing crops, do you mean the evidence is there they can achieve it? It's where they can't do it on poor, tufty, permanent pasture. Do you mean? So it's very achievable, but they've got to be on the right crop, in my opinion.
And both of you will know, and Joe, who asked the question, will also know the Rancompare farm up in Northumberland, who always he puts lambs on pure clover swards grown by an arable farmer and easily achieves that, doesn't he?
Yeah, but that is he's reaching biological maximum in terms of he's got really high quality genetic ewes, very high genetic quality rams on rocket fuel, and he's getting 400 plus grams a day. They're not even getting to weaning; they're off the farm before they even get chance.
Yeah.
But it is very achievable. But trying to get more farms to do what he's doing is going to be the interesting bit.
Yeah, very true. I mean, it is very achievable, but, you know, when you look at the results, I mean, you know, and where you haven't got weights to go on, if you go onto a farm and you've got nothing else, you can get hold of some of the marketing pattern. You can work that backwards. If you know when the lambs were born and when they were sold, you can do it on the back of an envelope. You can work out roughly what the growth rates are. And the number of times you'll work that out and it'll be over their lifetime well short of 200 grams a day, then the scope for improvement is massive.
Yes, and even if you have just got those growth pattern, those sale patterns, dividing the lambs down a bit. I always think it's very easy to think of just the whole flock, isn't it? But people do have their earlies and their laters, and you know that you can get quite a lot of detail in there. If the barrier is weighing lambs at 8 weeks, which sometimes that's a step too far.
And the other thing is, it's about. I'm working with someone who doesn't necessarily want to do all of them because it's a big job, but we've got to a point where they'll do a couple of groups or a proportion of a group, or so it doesn't have to be every lamb. It's just getting a feel from if you've got particular groups that you're interested in. It's to start somewhere, isn't it? And then, as we've all discussed before, which as soon as you've got a piece of information, the farmer wants another piece of information, so it drives them. It a lot of the time drives them to then want the next bit.
Yeah, natural competitiveness for themselves or for how they did last year, or the more you can build on that. I agree, really good. Do either of you want to tackle Joe's question about computer modelling on overwinter challenge? Is that do either of you know anywhere we can send him to look?
I would suggest you goes and talks to Hannah Veneer at Liverpool, who is doing a lot of work. She was at Bristol, but Hannah did a lot of work on modelling, and I would suggest that I point them in Hannah's direction.
And then Canada, they do a lot of freeze thawing, and they've got some sheep. That's a guess.
Paula might comment on that. That's brilliant. Thank you both. I'm aware it's 8:35. I just want to say again, thank you. Well, I really want to say thank you to Lesley and Liz for all of that. It's brilliant. Worked fine. Put it blended in together. Great, and it's really interesting. And some feedback from the chat. People liked it. Can I say thank you to Bimeda especially, who've sponsored this particular webinar, but also to all the different partners who have supported us in running these webinars. It's made, it's been really good fun apart from anything else. So that's great. And if you're watching and you've enjoyed it and you'd like to give to one of the charities we're supporting, either if you go onto that Just Giving site, you can either give to Send a Cow, who support livestock farmers in East Africa, or Vet Life, which was Vet Benevolent Fund. Either organisation would be delighted to receive funds. So yeah, I think this is the first webinar that we've actually managed to answer all the questions. So special star to Lesley and Liz for that.
We might have answered them, Fiona, but let's hope we answered them successfully.
It was
We've ticked the boxes, so I'm happy with that for now, Lesley.
I think Joe's one was a bit dodge, but other than that, it was fine.
We'll get him. But I really enjoyed that, though. Thank you, Fiona.
Yeah, well, thanks both. Thanks for everyone who's been, putting stuff in the chat and the questions. Yeah, really good. We're back in a fortnight's time, and Kate Phillips is going to take us through flock economics. So she's done work for one of the retailers on cost of production, and she's going to go through a sort of how Kate thinks vets can get involved and understanding better flock economics. So please come back and join us for that. And once again, many thanks, Lesley and Liz. Okay, I shall end us there.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, thanks. I can't end it.